Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Captain Patriotic. I hope everybody's doing well. If you tuned in last time, you may recall that we discussed in great detail the early history of the U.S. Air Force and what would not only lead to the creation of its own independent service branch from the U.S. Army, but I also talked about one of its pioneers at the time, Colonel James H. Doolittle. If you didn't get a chance to tune into that particular episode, I highly recommend that you do so to get a little bit more background story on one of our more popular service branches today. In addition to talking about the Air Force last time, today, I want to bring our attention back to my Korean War miniseries, where I have the honor and privilege of talking about the most decorated U.S. Air Force pilot to serve during the Korean War of 1950 through 1953. Now, that particular honor goes to none other than Major George Andrew Davis Jr. But before we dive deep into his story, I wanted to give you a little bit of background for the Air Force and its precursors. If you tuned into the last episode, you may recall that originally the Air Force was actually considered part of the U.S. Army for nearly half a century. In fact, the reminiscence of the Air Force actually started whenever it became a part of the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1907. Basically, at the time, it was used for surveillance and reconnaissance of the battle for Army troops, basically. Well, if you fast forward almost 10 years, whenever the U.S. enters World War I, that graduated to the U.S. Army Air Service, which included a bunch of fighter pilots, namely the famous Eddie Rickenbacker. And it basically served as its own independent service branch even during the Great War. Now, fast forward nearly 25 years later to World War II, and the Army Air Service was reorganized into what was then called the U.S. Army Air Forces, or Air Corps. And it was a big service branch, having, of course, being a sub-branch at that time to the biggest branch in the military, the U.S. Army, where it had pilots that served in both the European and African theater, as well as the Pacific theater. It was formally after World War II ended in 1947, whenever the U.S. Air Force was finally recognized as its own independent service branch, separated from the U.S. Army. So technically, the Korean War is the first official conflict that the U.S. Air Force served in as its own independent service branch from everybody else, which is really exciting because I'm not going to lie to you guys. You can look up in books and everything, but you will learn that the air war in Korea was actually pretty crucial to the outcome of that particular conflict, even though it technically ended in a tie for either side of the conflict. Without the air superiority of UN and US forces in Korea, I don't think the outcome would have been near as positive as it was back then. So anyway, shifting our focus back to George Davis Jr., this particular airman was a highly decorated fighter pilot and flying ace of the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, and then as a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War. He's famous for one air battle during the middle of the war, where he was actually killed in action during a combat mission in northwestern Korea. in an area commonly known by historians today as Mig Alley. Now, it was for his actions during that critical battle that Davis was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, as well as promoted from major to lieutenant colonel. If that doesn't tell you how bold and brave of an individual he was back then I don't know what else to tell you. Basically, in my mind's eye, I like to think of him as the Eddie Rittenbacher or Richard Bong of the Korean War. That's how popular of an individual and a leader he was in the Air Force. And he accomplished a lot during his tenure in the Army Air Forces and during the Air Force. But anyway, Davis was born officially in Dublin, Texas on December 1st, 1920. He was the seventh of 9 children born to George Davis Sr. and Pearl Love Davis. Now, during his childhood, his family moved around a lot in the central Texas area. In fact, for a time, he and his family actually lived in Maple, Texas, before eventually they settled in Morton, Texas, where he went to high school. So after graduating from there, he would then go on to attend Harding College in Searcy, Arkansas, and upon obtaining his degree, he would return to his home state of Texas, where he took up farming for a little while before eventually joining the military after December 7th, 1941. It was officially on March 21st, 1942, whenever Davis decided to go into the military, and he ultimately enlisted in the U.S. Army in Lubbock, Texas. Now, on June 3rd, 1942, he was appointed as an aviation cadet in the Army Air Corps, where he was moved to Kelly Field in San Antonio, Texas for pre-flight training, which he completed in a couple of months. Upon completion of that particular training, he was then moved to what was called Jones Field in Bonham, Texas for his main flight training. Now, it was during this set of training that he got his first 60 hours of flight time aboard a Fairchild PT-19 trainer aircraft. He would then go on to fly another 74 hours during basic flight training in Waco, Texas. And he underwent a final set of training aboard the T-6 Texan at Alo Field in Victoria, Texas. Officially on February 16th, 1943, Davis completed all of this training and was officially commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve, and was immediately ordered into active duty with the Army Air Forces. And by all this time, he had acquired some 315 hours of flight time during all of that various training to get him ready for war. Davis's first assignment as an active duty Army Air Forces personnel was to join the 312th Bombardment Group, which was based out of Bowman Field in Louisville, Kentucky, where he became qualified to fly the then new P-40 Warhog fighter plane. He would continue his training and qualification there until August of 1943, whenever the group was ordered to the Pacific Theater of Operations for combat duty. Now, once he and the 312th Bombardment Group arrived in the Pacific Theater, he would manage to fly in a couple of campaigns late in the Pacific War, which included both the New Guinea and Philippine Island campaigns of late 1944. It was during that short span of time where he would score 7 victories over Japanese aircraft. And while he was participating in these campaigns, he quickly gained a reputation as a skilled pilot and accurate gunner whose daredevil flying style contrasted with his quiet and reserved personality. In fact, he was awarded his first Silver Star Medal on December 24th, 1944, over Clark Field, which is located in Manila in the Philippines, whenever he led a flight of 3 P-47 aircraft in formation, escorting B-24 bombers on a mission when he saw 2 Japanese enemy fighters making a pass at the bombers from approximately 1,000 feet above. Well, upon seeing this enemy aircraft, he immediately turned in pursuit of one of them, chasing it to within firing distance, where his wingman at the time shot the plane down and caused the pilot to bail out. He then took his flight back to maintain cover for the bombers. Soon afterwards, he observed a formation of 8 to 10 more enemy planes that were in pursuit of the bombers themselves. Captain Davis thereupon went after one of them and fired 3 bursts, which resulted in the enemy's airplanes breaking into flames and crashing into a mountain. Returning again to his position, he saw another enemy fighter heading for the same bomber formation. Acting quickly, he climbed after it, firing from approximately 200 yards away. In a short amount of time, pieces flew off of the Japanese plane and burst into flames and ultimately crashed. His superb protection afforded the bombers by Captain Davis enabled them to carry out their bombing runs with a great effect against the enemy. This is just one example of the many harrowing experiences he would come to know from serving in World War II. And in fact, during his service in World War II, Davis flew a total of 266 combat missions and acquired a total of about some 705 combat hours and destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft during that time. For his exploits and service during World War II, not only was he awarded a Silver Star, which is the 3rd highest military decoration that any branch of the service can receive for valor in combat, just after the Service Crosses and the Medal of Honor. So in addition to his Silver Star, he was also awarded 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses for actions during the Philippine campaign of December 1944. In addition to those 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, he was also awarded a total of 9 air medals for different exploits during the Pacific War. And then, of course, he was awarded the World War II Victory Medal, as well as the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal for his service. By the end of World War II, Davis had in total over 2,200 hours of flight time in his whole entire Air Force career. So, needless to say, he proved himself to be a very valuable airman in that short period of time. And by the time World War II ends, he was already considered a highly decorated and accomplished individual in that particular branch, even well before the Korean War broke out some 5 years later. After the war's end, Davis served in several administrative positions within the United States. On August 10th, 1945, he was assigned to the 556th Air Base Unit located at Long Beach, California, A year later, on August 24th, 1946, he was offered a commission as a first lieutenant in the active duty Army Air Corps, which ultimately demoted him from his temporary rank at the time, but effectively allowed him to stay in the military despite the demobilization and downsizing of the U.S. military after the conclusion of World War II. A couple of weeks later, on September 7th, 1946, Davis was ordered to the 554th Air Base Unit located in Memphis, Tennessee, where he served on one of the Army Air Corps' aerobatic demonstration teams, which is basically the predecessor to the United States Air Force Thunderbirds. Davis would then return to frontline units a few months later in January of 1947 when he was moved to the 71st Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 1st Fighter Group, where he remained with this formation for most of that year. And whenever the U.S. Air Force was created as its own separate service branch on September 18th, 1947, Davis was ultimately commissioned as a captain in the newest branch of the military. Now, during his time and after his promotion to captain, Davis attended the Air Tactical School at Tyndall Air Force Base, close to Panama City, Florida, where he also served as a flight commander and air inspector during his time with that unit in peacetime. Now, fast forward a few years, and upon the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, Davis continued to serve in the 71st Squadron and did not see combat in the initial phase of the Korean War in 1950. However, as the war progressed, Davis began training on the then new F-86 Sabre, which was considered the latest jet engine-powered fighter jet that the United States had adopted into military service. On February 15th, 1951, he was promoted to major, and ultimately in October of 1951, he would be assigned to the headquarters of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing of the Air Force, which at that time was based in Japan and operated various aircraft throughout Korea. You could say that Davis officially entered combat in Korea in November of 1951, and it's noted that from November 1st till November 26th, 1951, he flew a total of 17 missions in the Sinanju and the Uaju areas, with most of those missions resulting in virtually no combat whatsoever. That doesn't mean, though, that he didn't see any action, and he most certainly did. For instance, during a patrol on November 4th, 1951, Davis was credited with a probable victory over a Russian-made MiG-15 fighter jet of the Soviet Air Force or Chinese Air Force, giving him his first official victory of the Korean War. Now, fast forward almost a week later to November 10th, 1951, where Davis was given command of the 334th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, which was considered a unit of the 4th Air Force Wing. At that time, Davis and the other pilots from his squadron were relocated to Kimbo Field, which is located just to the west of Seoul, South Korea's capital, in order to allow them the best access to MiG Alley in North Korea, where a lot of the heaviest air combat took place during the Korean War between U.S. and UN forces and Chinese and Soviet forces. At least in the later part of the Korean War, that's where a lot of the air fights took place to dominate the skies over Korea. It was a very important part of the Korean campaign, to say the least, but there's so many miniature air battles that took place in this time, you would really find it fascinating. But anyway, of his leadership at the time, subordinates often praised the quality of Davis's training, where he spent a great deal of time training new and younger pilots in tactics during various stages of his command. His superiors and commanders also noted that he often led by example. Therefore, Davis was known to be greatly respected even among his rival ace pilots in all the U.S. service branches. It was based off of this reputation that he gained the nickname One Burst Davis for his extremely accurate fire when in combat on an enemy plane. Toward the end of November 1951, that's when he started to experience more intense fighting during the Korean War. For example, on November 27, 1951, Davis was leading a formation of 32 U.S. F-86 Sabres on a patrol near the town of Sin-Anju when they spotted and attacked 6 enemy MiG-15s. Leading with great tactical skill and courage, Major Davis closed to 800 feet on a MiG-15, where he immediately downed one of the MiGs, striking its fuselage and forcing the pilot to bail out. He would then go on to pursue a second MiG-15 and damaged it, forcing that pilot to bail out as well. And he kept on doing this a couple of more times. In fact, in the whole engagement, 4 of the MiG-15s in the battle were destroyed by Davis's patrol group as a whole, and it was for his brave actions on this particular day that he would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest military medal for valor that was offered to both U.S. Army as well as U.S. Air Force personnel at the time, only being beat by the Medal of Honor. That's a pretty big honor in itself, you guys, and it takes a lot of guts and courage to get that. But he wasn't done, though, because for a couple of more days, Davis led relatively quiet patrols until November 30th, 1951, on his 22nd combat mission. It was around 1600 that day that Davis's flight of 8 F-86 Sabres spotted a large group of 9 Tu-2 bombers from the Chinese 8th Bomber Division, which was escorted by 16 La-11 fighters from the Chinese 2nd Fighter Division. That particular force at the time was en route to a bombing mission on Taehowado Island, which was located in the Pansong chain of islands on the west coast of North Korea. Davis maneuvered the patrol into position for a firing pass on these bombers, where he completed 4 attack runs on the formation, being continuously attacked by those La-11 fighters. However, they were unable to hit his aircraft because of his swift movements. In spite of being separated from his wingmen, he managed to destroy 2 of the bombers and cause the crew of a 3rd bomber to bail out at the last minute. By this time, another group of F-86s had arrived to continue the fight and to relieve his patrol, because Davis's aircraft was running low on both ammunition and fuel. However, as the flights attempted to withdraw, one of Davis's pilots, Raymond O. Barton, called for help. It was after that that Davis flew to his aid and found that Barton's damaged aircraft was under attack from 24 enemy MiG-15s of the Chinese 3rd Fighter Division, which had just arrived as reinforcements. As 2 of those MiG-15s prepared a final attack on Barton, Davis swooped through their pass and scored direct hits on one, which ultimately killed the Chinese flight leader who commanded the MiG attack in the first place. The second broke off its attack from Barton altogether. Davis then escorted Barton's damaged aircraft back to base safely, where he landed with only 5 gallons of fuel left in all of his tanks. Now, it was for his courageous actions on that day that Davis would be awarded his second Silver Star Medal. The Tehuado bombing mission ultimately forced the Chinese Air Force to end all bombing missions for the rest of the war due to this particular attack by Davis and his patrol, while his hat trick +1 of downing 4 Chinese aircraft in the flight resulted in raising Davis's confirmed victory count in Korea to 6, making him the 5th jet ace of the war, as well as the first man in the history of the U.S. military to become an ace in 2 wars. That's a pretty big accomplishment, you guys. That tells you how confident of a pilot he was. A week later, on December 5th, 1951, Davis flew his next combat mission, or his 23rd one of the war. While on a search and destroy patrol over Rinko-Do, Davis spotted 2 MiG-15s, where he shot one down and forced the other one to withdraw. 10 minutes later, he spotted another MiG-15 preparing to attack near Hatchinang and destroyed it as well. Just over a week later, on December 13th, 1951, another group of MiG-15s attacked Davis during a morning patrol near the town of Yongwon. Davis, in that engagement, destroyed 1 MiG, and as a second MiG attempted to target his wingman, Davis outmaneuvered it and shot it down as well. At the end of the patrol, Davis had amassed 10 victories, making him the first double ace of the Korean War. Now, it was for this heroic action that he would be awarded his 3rd Silver Star Medal. During an afternoon patrol on that same day, he was commanding 22 F-86s when Davis spotted 50 MiG-15s in the Suncheon, South Korea area, heading further south towards the Tachon area. He surprised and destroyed 1 MiG and then turned on another in an aggressive attack that forced the MiG pilot to bail out. This ultimately resulted in him being awarded his 3rd Distinguished Flying Cross. So thus, after 30 combat missions in Korea by the end of the month, Davis had claimed 12 victories against enemy aircraft. It was after this successful series of patrols that Davis was ordered to conduct only 1 patrol a day to minimize the risk that was put upon him. Apparently, that order had previously been sent on December 1st, 1951, but Davis basically ignored it because he was trying to do his job, basically. At the time, both the Air Force as well as Davis's family had growing concerns that Chinese and Soviet pilots would be gunning for him, given his recent success and fame. And it was at that point he had 12 victories, whereas the second highest scoring aces of that war each had 6. This basically meant that Davis was averaging 1 victory for every 3 missions that he was on. Pretty impressive, might I say. In January 1952, Davis wrote home expressing frustration at the slow logistics of replacement aircraft parts, claiming that this was slowing down missions. He also began to express contempt for the F-86 Sabre, feeling at times it was being outperformed by the MiG-15s, and that something will have to be done to give the UN pilots more of an advantage in combat. He also stated that he had begun to grow tired of the constant publicity around him, where he quoted that, "They're trying to make a hero of me, and I find it rather embarrassing." And at other times, Davis indicated that he preferred to stay in combat to protect his men and to be the role model that he is. It wasn't until late January of 1952 that the Air Force told Davis that they wanted to rotate him back to the United States, because at that particular point, Davis had held every record possible for a jet pilot, including the most victories in all types of aircraft, the most MiG-15s destroyed, as well as the most victories over propeller-driven aircraft at the time. However, the Air Force ultimately determined that it had no capable replacement for who could take over command of Davis's squadron, and other pilots at that time, of course, indicated that they wanted him to stay, where they considered him to be able, as well as a very effective leader. So the decision was ultimately made for him to stay overseas in Korea. If we fast forward a couple of weeks to February 10th, 1952, Davis would fly his 59th and ultimately last combat mission of the Korean War in an F-86E Sabre. Now, the circumstances of the actions of that day, which would ultimately lead to Davis's death, as well as the identity of the person who ultimately killed him, to remain controversial to this very day. It was on February 10th that he led a flight of 4 F-86s on a patrol near the Yalu River, close to the Manchurian border. Davis's group was a part of a larger UN force of 18 F-86s that were operating in the area. As his patrol reached the border, one of his F-86 pilots reported that he was out of oxygen, prompting Davis to order him to return to base with his wingman. As Davis continued patrolling with one wingman, Second Lieutenant William W. Littlefield, and cruising at an altitude of some 38,000 feet, both of them spotted a flight of 12 Soviet MiG-15s of the Chinese 4th Fighter Division heading in the direction of a group of U.S. F-84 Thunderjets who were conducting a low-level bombing mission on North Korean communication lines. The MiGs were some 8,000 feet below Davis and Littlefield and had not noticed them at all. Without any hesitation, Davis immediately flew below the MiG-15 formation and attacked them from the rear. His surprise attack destroyed one of the MiG-15s in the first round of attacks, and he quickly turned his attention to the next closest MiG and destroyed it before that one could outmaneuver him. By this time, Davis and Littlefield had overtaken many of the MiGs in that formation, and some of them were already behind and gunning for him. As Davis then moved to target a third MiG-15 at the front of the formation, he was trying to line up his shot whenever a MiG directly behind him fired a burst from his machine gun and scored a direct hit on Davis's fuselage, which caused his aircraft to spin out of control. Now, observing all of this, Littlefield later said that he had spotted Davis's landing gear open, which ultimately indicated that he was having hydraulic failure, and he had attempted to defend Davis's aircraft as it lost altitude until Davis ultimately crashed and died. Littlefield also reported that he had not seen Davis bail out of his aircraft at all. Therefore, Davis was declared missing in action and presumed killed. In the following days, there were intense aerial searches of the area that later revealed no evidence that Davis had survived the crash. Indeed, a week after the incident, the Chinese military searched the area for themselves and recovered his body. To this day, the Chinese never returned Davis's body to the United States. So, guys, he ultimately paid the ultimate sacrifice to support the mission and to support the men under his command. In his 4 months of combat service in Korea, Davis was a legend because he had scored 14 confirmed victories over enemy aircraft, one probable victory, as well as was responsible for 2 more aircraft being damaged, which brought his career victory total between World War II and Korea to 21. Now, immediately after receiving a report of Davis's actions and his last mission, his fellow ace, Colonel Harrison Tong, who was commander of the 4th Wing, recommended Davis for the Medal of Honor. Over a year later, on April 15, 1953, Davis was posthumously promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel. And a year after that, on May 14th, 1954, his Medal of Honor would be presented to his wife by General Nathan F. Twining, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. All in all, for his service in the Korean War, albeit short, he was decorated with a lot of medals, which include the following: 2 Silver Star medals, bringing his total to 3 Silver Stars between World War II and Korea. He was also decorated with 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, bringing his total to 4 between World War II and Korea. 1 Air Medal, bringing his total to 10 of those between World War II and Korea. The Distinguished Service Cross, as well as a Purple Heart Medal and the Medal of Honor, which he had earned both of those posthumously, which does not include any of the other various American and other campaign medals and other decorations for his service during both of those conflicts. So, put it plainly, you guys, Major Davis was an icon in the early 50s. He was very influential, and even though he was a reserved personality, he really did care about the men under his command, as well as his fellow airmen in general. Yeah, his tenure in Korea may have been short, but it left a lasting impact on the history of the Korean War. In fact, he was so fierce in combat that he was almost characterized with having the same type of tactics as Eddie Rittenbacher in World War I, as well as Richard Bong during World War II. And it's very impressive that somebody would be so committed to service to his country that he would ultimately pay the ultimate sacrifice for the good of his men and for the mission in general. You can't get more patriotic and bold than that, you guys. That's just very, very impressive. So, you guys, I appreciate y'all tuning in this time. And please leave a like and subscribe. And certainly tune in for next time. Have a wonderful day, everybody.